President Trump again imposed unjustified tariffs on our nation.
For Canada, Canadian interests, of course, the United States is looking out, the President's looking out for the interests of American workers.
Breaking news out of Washington has just sent shockwaves across North America. Donald Trump, never one to shy away from controversy, has unleashed a stunning economic strike, this time against Canada, a sweeping 35% tariff on all Canadian goods. But while the headlines focus on Trump's move, something far bigger is brewing in the shadows. On June 30th, 2025,
oil and gas and other energy could be part of our response to the Americans. The reality is putting Canadian tariffs on American energy.
A single event quietly shifted the balance of global energy power. Canada, for the first time in history, bypassed the United States and sent its natural gas directly to Asia. What does this mean for the world economy, and more importantly, for America? Stay tuned. For more than 3 decades, Canada's energy lifeline flowed in one direction, south, straight into the United States. Pipelines carried billions of dollars worth of natural gas across the border year after year. In 2024 alone, that figure reached a staggering $8 billion. But here's the problem: dependence comes at a price. Whenever political winds shifted in Washington, Canada's economy trembled. The tariffs, the trade wars, the unpredictable policies, all of it trapped Canada's energy sector in a tightening grip of risk. That grip is now broken. The opening of the LNG Canada terminal in Kitimat, British Columbia, is nothing less than a historic turning point. Built over 7 long years at a cost of nearly 40 billion Canadian dollars, this mega project has given Canada something it never truly had before: independence. Independence from U.S. pipelines. Independence from unpredictable tariffs. Independence from being just a supplier to its southern neighbor. For the first time, Canadian gas is on the open seas, sailing toward Asia's biggest economies where demand is surging and the future of global energy is being rewritten. Imagine this. What once took up to 20 days through the Panama Canal, burdened with middlemen and U.S. oversight, can now be done in just 10. Direct shipping lanes across the Pacific, faster, cheaper, freer. The very first shipment aboard the gas-logged Glasgow carried 2.66 million tons of high-grade liquefied natural gas, compressed to more than 600 times smaller than its original size, chilled to an icy minus 165 degrees Celsius. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just about fuel, it was about freedom. Trump's administration had already slammed Canada with new tariffs earlier in March 2025. 25% on most goods, 10% directly on energy. The message was clear: play by Washington's rules or pay the price. But Asia is writing a different story. Japan is racing to add 20 million tons of LNG capacity every year starting in 2026. South Korea is expanding its LNG storage by 50% in the next decade. And China, Beijing has already signed multiple long-term contracts to lock in supplies before the next brutal winter. In this white-hot demand zone, Canada just walked in as the newest, most timely supplier. Let's break it down. For decades, Canadian gas sold for less than the U.S. benchmark. Producers had little choice. They were stuck with one buyer, one market, one pipeline. And when tariffs hit, those already thin margins nearly collapsed. Now the pivot to Asia has turned the tables. Instead of begging for access through U.S. pipelines, Canada now controls a direct lifeline to the fastest-growing energy markets on Earth. And these aren't just customers. These are energy-hungry giants who view LNG as the cornerstone of their national strategies. For Japan, it's about replacing nuclear risks with cleaner, stable imports. For South Korea, it's about energy security in a region overshadowed by North Korean tensions. For China, it's about diversifying away from U.S.-controlled energy sources while still pushing forward on climate goals. This isn't just business, it's geopolitics. Every shipment of Canadian LNG across the Pacific is another crack in America's decades-long energy dominance. But here's something most headlines won't tell you. Beyond the geopolitics and dollar signs, this project has transformed lives inside Canada itself. During its 7-year construction phase, LNG Canada generated more than 50,000 jobs across the country. From engineers to welders, from truck drivers to local suppliers, whole communities were reshaped. Indigenous nations weren't left out either. Contracts worth nearly 6 billion Canadian dollars went directly to local firms and the Haisla Nation, who also secured equity in the Coastal GasLink pipeline that stretches nearly 700 kilometers across rugged terrain to feed the terminal. And here's where it gets interesting. LNG Canada is not just another fossil fuel plant. It's powered primarily by hydroelectricity, making it one of the lowest emission LNG terminals on the planet. 2 massive liquefaction trains churn out up to 14 million tons of LNG annually, while equipment designed in Japan and the US helps keep the carbon footprint to a minimum. So while critics point to rising costs compared to US Gulf Coast projects, Canada has built something few others can claim: a cleaner, more sustainable gateway to the future of energy. Of course, progress never comes without a price tag. The sheer scale of LNG Canada has driven costs sky high, forcing British Columbia's provincial government to step in with targeted carbon and sales tax incentives. These measures softened the blow for investors, but not without sparking heated debate. Critics argue that taxpayers are carrying too much of the burden, while corporations reap the long-term profits. Supporters counter that without these incentives, Canada would have missed its once-in-a-century chance to rewrite its role in global energy. And here's the truth: the gamble may already be paying off. By 2026, LNG Canada is projected to send more than 170 voyages every year across the Pacific, fueling the power grids of cities from Yokohama to Busan, and even as far as Singapore. That's not just trade. That's a geopolitical reset. Every ship that sails east carries more than liquefied gas. It carries a signal. Canada is no longer chained to America's policy swings. The ambitions don't stop here. The long-term plan? Double production capacity, from 14 million to 28 million tons annually. If successful, Canada would rank among the top 5 LNG exporters on Earth, standing shoulder to shoulder with giants like Qatar and Australia. But scaling up means another tidal wave of investment. Tens of billions more, stricter environmental standards, and global partners willing to bet on Canada's stability. The timing, however, could not be better. Asia is desperate for reliable energy partners. Coal is being phased out. Russian gas comes with heavy political strings attached, and oil markets remain a roller coaster of sanctions, wars, and volatility. This is where Canada's image, stable, democratic, and environmentally conscious, becomes its secret weapon. Unlike oil from the Middle East or pipeline gas from Russia, Canadian LNG is seen as predictable, transparent, and safe. Each new shipment out of Kitimat isn't just about dollars. It's about influence. It's about carving out a new identity on the world stage. Not a secondary supplier to America, but a primary partner to Asia. For decades, Canada's energy future was dictated by one border, the southern one. Nearly 100% of its exported gas flowed into the United States. This dependency left Canada constantly exposed, vulnerable to decisions it couldn't control: tariffs, regulations, and political games. Now, that chain is breaking. With every LNG tanker crossing the Pacific, Canada gains more insulation from U.S. pressure. It's a quiet but undeniable shift in power dynamics. The U.S. once held the upper hand, setting the terms and dictating the price. But now, Asia is calling the shots, and Canada is answering directly. This isn't just a matter of trade. It's a matter of national sovereignty. For the first time, Canada is hedging its bets, playing multiple tables in the great game of global energy, and Washington knows it. Tariffs may have been designed to punish, but instead they forced Canada to leap into an entirely new market, a market so hungry, so vast, that America's leverage may never look the same again. Let's zoom out. Why Asia? Why now? Because demand here is exploding. Countries across the Pacific Rim are racing against time to secure stable, clean energy sources before their economies stall. Japan imports more than 80% of its total energy needs. For them, Canadian LNG isn't just fuel. It's a lifeline, a hedge against nuclear risks, and an escape from over-reliance on politically fragile suppliers. South Korea sees LNG as a buffer against volatile pipeline flows from Russia and the Middle East. For Seoul, every Canadian shipment is a shield of energy security. And then there's China, the giant. Beijing knows that its industrial machine cannot run on coal alone. Canadian LNG offers a stabilizer in a market constantly rattled by sanctions, shipping bottlenecks, and Middle Eastern instability. But here's the real twist. These countries aren't just buyers, they're partners. Companies from Japan, South Korea, China, and even Malaysia are deeply embedded in LNG Canada as joint venture investors. That means Asia isn't just waiting for shipments, they're helping build the infrastructure itself. This changes everything. It ties Canada's future not only to its own ambitions, but to the direct economic interests of Asia's largest economies. So where does this leave Canada? At a crossroads unlike any in its history. Expansion could catapult it into the ranks of the world's LNG superpowers. Failure could leave billions wasted and ambitions shattered. But one thing is already certain. Canada's energy future is no longer tethered to Washington's decisions. It is sailing eastward, toward Yokohama, toward Busan, toward Beijing. And as the Pacific routes open wider, a bigger question looms. Can the United States tolerate watching its northern neighbor slip from its grip and into the waiting arms of Asia? Here's a twist most people miss. LNG Canada isn't just Canada's project. It's a multinational alliance. Japanese, South Korean, Chinese, and Malaysian companies all have skin in the game. Why does that matter? Because spreading financial risk also ties buyer and seller together for decades. If Japan invests in the plant, Japan has a vested interest in seeing Canadian gas flow smoothly for the long haul. But global leadership in energy isn't won by steel and concrete alone. It requires something deeper: trust, reliability, environmental responsibility, long-term planning. That's where LNG Canada's blueprint stands out. It connects British Columbia's massive Montney Basin reserves to state-of-the-art liquefaction technology while weaving in indigenous partnerships and environmental safeguards that most rivals can't claim. It's not just gas. It's a model for how a resource-rich democracy competes in a world of superpowers. But the real test is just beginning. The goal? Double capacity, from 14 million tons to 28 million tons of LNG each year. That would place Canada among the top 5 exporters worldwide, standing shoulder to shoulder with Qatar, the US, and Australia. Sounds impressive, right? But here's the catch. Doubling production won't just mean adding another assembly line. It means new pipelines snaking through mountains, larger liquefaction facilities, and maybe even a second marine terminal. Each of these steps carries a price tag in the tens of billions of dollars. And investors? They're looking harder than ever at ESG, environmental, social, and governance performance. In a high-interest rate world, you don't just need profits on paper. You need credibility. Canada's challenge is clear. If it wants to secure the capital, it must prove to the world that Phase 1 wasn't a fluke, that it can scale responsibly while keeping emissions low, communities on board, and global buyers confident. Here's where things get even tougher. Canada faces some of the strictest environmental standards of any LNG producer on Earth. A national carbon pricing regime and provincial rules in British Columbia force constant investment in cleaner tech, biodiversity protections, and potentially even carbon capture systems. If LNG Canada fails to hit these marks, it risks regulatory penalties, investor backlash, and reputational damage. The bar is higher than in Qatar, higher than in the Gulf Coast, higher than in Australia. Yet, this is also Canada's edge. Energy buyers in Asia are no longer looking only at cost per ton. They're asking, how clean is it? How sustainable? How inclusive? This is why Canada's partnership with the Haisla Nation is so crucial. Indigenous communities aren't just consultants. They're shareholders, with equity in pipelines and tangible economic returns flowing back into their lands. That kind of inclusive growth is becoming a metric of trust. For Japan, South Korea, and China, whose own citizens are demanding cleaner, greener imports, Canada's ESG credibility is just as valuable as the gas itself, with flexible contracts that appeal to buyers. Australia is doubling down with offshore projects and deeper Southeast Asian ties. For Canada to compete with these energy giants, agility is key. That means moving quickly on Phase 2 of the LNG Canada project, while also advancing new export facilities like Cedar LNG and KSI Lissam's LNG, projects that put Indigenous leadership at the center. Expanding terminal capacity reduces bottlenecks. and gives Canada the flexibility to handle market shifts, spot demand, and regional supply disruptions. Another advantage in Canada's favor, low-carbon LNG. As carbon pricing and border adjustments become reality in Europe and Asia, emissions intensity is now part of every procurement decision. Canada, powered by hydroelectricity and regulated under some of the strictest frameworks in the world, stands out. But to maintain that edge, bold investments are required. Carbon capture, advanced methane monitoring, and electrified upstream production. Domestically, Canada also faces a balancing act. Citizens want growth, but they also demand transparency, accountability, and sustainability. Indigenous inclusion is critical to this trust. The Haisla Nation's role in LNG Canada isn't symbolic. It's transformational. Future projects will likely follow this model, where Indigenous communities are not just stakeholders, but true equity partners. This matters globally, too. In an era of ethical sourcing and environmental justice, Canada's model of shared ownership and responsibility is a powerful differentiator. Ultimately, the goal is bigger than exporting gas. It's about Canada becoming a pillar of global energy stability, a supplier trusted not just for its volume, but for its vision. That first cargo ship leaving Kitimat in June 2025 wasn't just fuel, it was a signal. A message that Canada has entered the global stage as an energy partner defined by integrity, innovation, and intent. The road ahead won't be simple. It will demand coordination, resilience, and forward thinking. But if this opening chapter is any sign, Canada is ready not just to compete, but to help define what responsible energy leadership looks like in the 21st century. And as competition intensifies, from Qatar, the US, and Australia, Canada's advantage lies in what others can't easily replicate: cleaner gas, stronger partnerships, and a model built on fairness. Remember, this is only the beginning of Canada's LNG story. The question is, can it keep pace with the global heavyweights, or will it fall behind? Before you click away, hit like if you found this breakdown insightful, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into global shifts shaping our world. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.